I continue my series of video on Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I will put the link to the first video in which I broadly introduced Rousseau as a complicated, conflicted character. And now I will comment the discourse on the sciences and the arts, and I give broadly the context, the historical context. The Academy of Dijon, which was kind of a college or university, it's not strictly speaking, but it was an academy, asked a question whether or not the re-establishment of sciences and arts has contributed to purify the moeurs. And in this video, when I use the word moeurs, it's the Latin mores, which has given morality. And in English, it would be ethical behavior. But instead of saying ethical behavior or moral behavior, I would say moeurs. It's the way in which people behave in relation to their personal morality and to their vision of religion and God, but also in relation to the life of the community, the way they dress, the way they speak, the way they talk, the way they live their life in a social setting and also in a psychological relation to their own consciousness. So that's complicated. So when I use the word moeurs or mores in Latin, but I will speak moeurs, it's ethical life in the broad sense. So that was the question asked by the Academy, and Rousseau wrote a discourse. He won the prize in 1750, and in a warning to the reader, he says, "What is fame?" So after having won, what is fame? Here is the unfortunate book to which I owe my own fame. So he was already this kind of pathetic figure who became famous. There are many artists in the modern day who make songs about how it's difficult to become famous once you succeed in music, or there are many artists who become insane because fame drives them insane. And Rousseau was one of the first examples of such a case, because the diffusion, the spread of books was becoming widespread in 18th century Europe. It had already been for a couple of centuries, but with the rise of the bourgeois class and the salons, which were the meeting places, the café, he became very famous very quickly for his time. So in the preface, he complains about the metaphysical subtleties, but he himself had psychological subtleties, and the psyche is a part of metaphysics. But yeah, he says that he wants to share one of these truths which hold dear to the happiness of the human species. And Rousseau, to give a broad context, he had no formal education. He was not from a highly bourgeois class or an aristocratic class. He was self-taught in a way, but he was a man of very high culture. He was very intelligent, he was brilliant, and he complained about, in this discourse he will complain about science and arts, but he himself was interested in most of the topics of his time, and he was aware of the ideas of science and philosophy, and he had a very deep knowledge of history. So he was a very educated man, but self-educated partly. Hopefully, I'm translating, hopefully people will forgive me. I think that I will be hardly, or it will be difficult for me to, it will be difficult for others to forgive me for the idea that I have decided to defend, because I am the idea that I defend in this discourse are hurting what makes the admiration of all men, and I can only expect to be universally blamed and only approved by a few wise persons. But I do not care about pleasing beautiful minds or beautiful spirits, nor fashionable people. In all times and in all centuries, there were men who were made to be subjugated and influenced by the opinions of their century. But one should not write for such readers. One should write to seek to live beyond one's own century. So there's already this very conflicting aspect of Rousseau, that in his personal life he's a very kind person, but he defends ideas which are at odds with his entire century and who are conflicting with the interests of everyone, basically. So, yeah. And he succeeded, and he was right, because Rousseau, he was not only very famous during his lifetime, but he became ever more famous in the next couple of centuries, and his influence has kept growing on all aspects of human spirit, as I've shown in my introduction. So the question is, that's the beginning of the speech, the question is whether or not the re-establishment of the sciences and the arts in the context of the Renaissance, so it has been, there had been 2.5 centuries of rebirth of the arts and the sciences in Europe, and especially since the 17th century with Galileo and Descartes and then Kepler before that. And so, yeah, whether or not it has helped or enabled to purify or to corrupt the moeurs, the ethical behavior. He says that it's difficult to defend his opinion in front of one of the most knowledgeable and wise and erudite academies in Europe. But he says that virtue, moral probity, I don't know if it exists in English, but moral behavior is dearest and dearer to those who are good than knowledge is to those who are knowledgeable. So for Rousseau, the love of the good is more important to the good man than the love of science to the scientific mind. That's one of Rousseau's view. He says that according to his natural light, he has decided to defend the truth, and the natural light is the light of God implemented in every human soul to help every individual to enlighten himself and others. And he says there is a price that I value more than anything else. It is within the bottom of my heart that I will find it. He says that nature has shrouded man in darkness and has enabled man to inspect, to have a broad view of the vastness of the universe. So there's this outward burst of man towards a broad view of the universe through the scientific activity, but also to go deep within oneself to explore and study the duties and the ends, the purposes of man within the exploration and the introspection of one's soul. So there's this outward view of the world and this inward introspection. And Rousseau did both. He was a man who was knowledgeable in the external world of scientific, artistic, historical, and political ideas of his time, and who explored the depth of his own soul. And then he makes in broad outline the history of Europe, that Europe had fell into barbarism in the Middle Ages, and it was Muslims who helped the sciences be reborn in Europe through the mediation of the translation of Aristotle, notably, who were translated and passed on to Europe through the mediation of the Muslim world, which had preserved the heritage of Greek culture. So Europe owes a part of its knowledge to the Muslim world. in the Middle Ages, and it has enabled Europe to thrive and to develop. And then again, of course, there was the fall of Constantinople by the attack of the Turks, which captured and conquered Constantinople, and the Byzantine philosophers and scientists and wise men were forced to flee, and they brought their own knowledge with them to Europe in the 15th century, which enabled a rebirth of European knowledge and which symbolically unleashed the Renaissance. So yeah. He says that one of the main advantages of the muses, it's the poetic way of the artistic endeavors, is to give men the desire and the wish to please one another, so to become polite, to have an artificial, precisely for Rousseau it's an artificial will to please one another. He says that spirit or mind as well as body both have their needs, and the needs of the body are the foundation of civic association of society. Men, according to Rousseau, unite in a civic society in order to satisfy the needs of their bodies. So he has, in this way, a Marxist view, a pre-Marxist view. And the needs of the mind and of the spirit are the byproduct and the pleasant, enjoyable byproducts of that. And the letters and the arts, so arts, he says that need, material need, is that which brought forth political domination, the throne, the power of the state in the symbolism of the king. In his time, Europe was mostly dominated by kingdoms. There were republics already, but mostly dominated by kingdoms. So it was material need which gave rise, according to him, to kingdoms and the authority of the king and the state. But the sciences and the arts have been used by the temporal power to reinforce and strengthen its own domination. So there's already this Marxist idea that the dominant ideas are the ideas of the dominant class. So we already find this in Rousseau. He talks about the magnificence of Athens and Rome, and he says that our century and our nation, which here means the French nation of the 18th century, will gain dominance in the intellectual realm over all times and all peoples. So he had a deep consciousness of his place within the unfolding of world spirit, as Hegel calls it. So he understood that he was living in a special century that would influence tremendously the rest of times. And the 18th century is still considered by many liberals and many people who know a bit about history as one of the most influential centuries ever, because it is the century of enlightenment, and most of the philosophical, political, moral ideas of modernity have had their birth or their development in the 18th century. One can always trace back the origins further in time, and there has been many influential ideas in the 19th century also, but the 18th century, the age of enlightenment, has been profoundly influential, and the ideas of French authors and the French Revolution have shaken and shaped the world for the past 200 years. The ideas, the political ideas of the French Revolution have been tremendously influential all over the world. And he says, that's one of Rousseau's key ideas, how sweet it would be to live among us if the external appearance was one with the internal dispositions of our heart. If decency, the external appearance of decency was internal virtue, if our rules of conduct were rules that we applied to the conduct of our life in our everyday life, if true philosophy was inseparable from the title of philosopher, so how sweet it would be to live among men if the the formal philosophers, those who teach philosophy in classrooms, were real philosophers. So how sweet it would be if philosophers were wise and not seekers of wisdom. Yeah. And then he says that the wealth of external appearance and elegance, like in clothing and elegance and external appearance, he compares that as some sort of corruption to the purity of the healthy and robust and strong peasant, the worker of the land, who is much more modest in his external appearance, but he is, according to Rousseau, much more virtuous. So there's this idea that luxury and wealth are signs of moral corruption and decadence, and that simplicity is a sign of moral health, moral in the sense of spiritual and moral virtue. He says, the good man, the man of good, is an athlete who enjoys I'm sorry, I can't. The man of good is I will skip this passage because it's too yeah. But there's this idea in Rousseau that politeness, which is the flowering of civilization, civilized men think that politeness, the ability of men to enjoy conversation, of being polite to one another, is the pinnacle of civilization, and that the barbaric nations are rough and they lack moral refinement. And he says that for him, politeness is a kind of moral corruption, because we are polite not of the purity of our heart, according to Rousseau, but because of social necessities. So we are already, by being social members of a society, we are morally corrupt for Rousseau. And I will talk about Molière and his play The Misanthrope. I can talk about it now. Rousseau, Molière is considered the greatest comical writer in French history, and he made many comedies, and they are good, but he's not like Shakespeare in the sense that his comedies are strictly comical. They're often they are psychologically deep, but they are superfluous in a sense and frivolous. But there's one of his comedies, which is The Misanthrope, which is psychologically very deep and very spiritual, because it's kind of a tragedy. It's a comical tragedy, because he depicts Alceste, which is a character who is the misanthrope, the main character of the play, who suffers from a deep love of honesty. And it's not that he hates, but he resents men for their lack of honesty. So he is ruthlessly honest. And of course, he is disliked because he always speaks the truth. And it creates resentment from others who live in this, it's 17th century France, the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie of France, where there are many social conventions and the need to please one another through a lot of politeness, precisely. So he wants to be ruthlessly honest, but at the same time he's deeply in love with a woman who is the exact opposite of himself. She's frivolous, she's superficial, she likes to please people, she talks about people behind their back. So he values honesty, and at the same time he's deeply in love with a frivolous woman who is very intelligent, but she's superficial according to his own standards. So that's a comedy, because he's made fun of all along the play because of his ludicrous his ridiculous behavior. But at the same time, he's a tragic character, because he expresses the difficult aspect of human condition, that we are forced to lie to ourselves and to lie to others constantly. And yeah, and that's a very profound play. That's probably Molière's greatest play. And the reason why I speak about this is that Rousseau was one of the few people, at least in his time, who saw in the Misanthrope by Molière not a comedy, but a tragedy. And he identified with Alceste, the Misanthrope, and it was common in the French literate circles to make fun of Alceste and to cast him as a ridiculous character, but Rousseau had empathy for Alceste because he identified himself with this character, because Rousseau himself was in a conflicted position of willing to speak the truth, but at the same time a deep sense of kindness for others. So he was forced to be polite and to apply the social standards of his time, which was refinement and kind of hypocrisy. So he was conflicted himself. And yeah, that's what I had to say. He says that suspicion, fears, coldness, even hatred and betrayal will constantly hide behind this veil of politeness. So politeness for Rousseau is not the pinnacle of civilization, it's the pinnacle of decadence. Because when you are polite, you are hiding your dark nature to others. So that's a progress to be polite, and everyone is taught to be polite. But at the same time, in the view of Rousseau, it's the sign of moral decay. So that's very complex. And himself, Rousseau was polite and kind to others, but in his writings, he complained about politeness. So yeah. He says that he complains about, he denounces national hatreds, the conflicts between the nations, which were mostly between the various kingdoms. But at the same time, he deplored that the end of national conflicts would bring about the loss of the love of the fatherland. So he was aware of the problems of nationalism, although strictly speaking, nationalism did not exist as such in his time, but the problem of the conflict between the nations. But at the same time, he was a deep patriot. So he had a deep love for patriotism, and for him, patriotism was Spartan patriotism, Roman patriotism. And so he was conflicted. He imagines, that's a common thread in European literature, he imagined an inhabitant from a distant land who would look at European society with a neutral point of view and to try to have an idea of the European moeurs, ethical behaviors, and about the state of the sciences and the perfection of the arts and the moral acceptability of our public shows, theaters, and so on, the politeness of our manners, the depth and wealth, not the depth, the linguistic wealth, I'm sorry, my English is not good enough, of our speeches, the rhetorical aspect of our speeches, our perpetual showings of goodness and kindness. He says, but by looking at us from an external point of view, looking at 18th century France, this stranger, this inhabitant of a distant land, would believe that Europeans were morally superior, but he would guess the exact opposite of the truth, according to Rousseau, that Europeans of the 18th century were morally bankrupt, according to Rousseau, because they were constantly deceiving and hiding their true nature. So Rousseau is a radical critique of the Enlightenment in the very core of the Enlightenment. So to classify Rousseau as a thinker of the Enlightenment because he lived in the 18th century, it's an easy way to classify, but at the same time he was an anti-Enlightenment thinker who was himself enlightened. That's complicated. he says that our souls have been corrupted to the extent that our sciences and our arts have progressed towards perfection. So there's an inversely proportional relationship between the corruption of the soul and the increase of artistic and scientific knowledge for Rousseau. And then that's Rousseau's paradoxes. He says that the elevation and the fall, not the fall, the increase and decrease of the waters of the ocean are influenced by the cycles of the moon and the gravitational activity of the moon. And he says that the fate of our moeurs and the probity or the virtue of our virtue is correlated to the progress of science and arts in the same way that the rise of the ocean is correlated to the movements of the moon. So he is explaining in a poetic way the most scientifically advanced ideas of his time. Well, these were ideas of the generation before, expounded by Newton, but he is complaining about the downfall of morality brought about by science by comparing the fall of morality with the idea that only the highest scientific achievements of mankind in the form of the Newtonian system of physics could explain. So he is himself full of science. So he's such a complex character and paradoxical. And yeah. Then he talks about Egypt, where philosophy and arts have had their birth in the history of mankind. There were arts and philosophy before, but the first literary sources at the time, we had no knowledge of Mesopotamia and Sumeria and all that. So Egypt was considered to be the oldest civilization, and it probably still is partly. And he says that the arts and the philosophy developed in Egypt, and then Egypt was conquered by Persia, by Alexander, by the Romans, by the Arabs, and by the Turks. So for him, there was a direct correlation between the increase of knowledge and the loss of political sovereignty by being conquered by less advanced people culturally. He says that Greece was populated by heroes, and when the arts progressed and increased, Greece was conquered by Alexander and became enslaved by Macedonia and then by the Romans. And that the eloquence of Demosthenes, the Athenian orator, could not prevent the decadent Athenians from saving themselves against the enslavement by Alexander. So for him, civic virtue and civic sovereignty and freedom was much more important than artistic and scientific achievements. And he says that the Roman Republic started to degenerate when literature started to flourish, and that Rome, who was founded by peasants and laborers of the land, reached the pinnacle of degeneracy under the flowering of poetry and literature in the imperial era. And that's when Rome became, who was the temple of virtue under the Republic, became the theater of crime, the shame of nations, and the plaything of barbarians. He talks about the debauchery, the corruption, the murders, and the crimes in Constantinople, who was the source of knowledge and science, the Byzantine Empire. He says that the Chinese are very literate and highly educated, but that they have been conquered and dominated by the barbarian hordes of Mongolia many times. He talks about the early Persians, who were Aryan peoples, who subjugated and dominated the whole of Asia. The Scyths, who were, as far as I know, a people of the Balkans and the southeastern Europe, who lived north in the northwest or northeast, I don't know, of Greece, and the Germans, not the Germans of modern Germany, the Germans of before the advent of the conquest of Charlemagne, and the Germanic and the Germans who lived outside the borders of the Roman Empire, so the barbaric Germans, so to speak. He praised the simplicity and innocence and virtues of these people. He talked about a republic of semi-gods or demigods or half-gods by referring to Sparta, where the virtue of the Spartans were above humanity. They transcended humanity in a way. So for him, he admired Sparta for their virtuous achievements much more than he admired Athens for its artistic, literary, and scientific and philosophical achievements. And he praised Sparta for getting rid of the artists and the poets and the scientists to preserve the military virtue of its constitution. He says that in Sparta, men seem to be born virtuous, and the air of the country they breathe seemed to inspire virtue in them. Then he praises Socrates for his praise of ignorance. He praises Cato, the old Cato in the Roman Republic, who complained about the degenerative impact of Greek cultural influence. He praised the Romans. He blamed the Romans for having become a city of philosophers and rhetorical speakers, and they started to neglect agriculture and military discipline. So you can see that Rousseau, who is considered a radical leftist, he speaks like a far-right extremist in today's terms. He says that, he quotes Roman philosophers, ever since philosophers have begun to appear among us, men of virtue have disappeared. So for him, there is a direct correlation between science and moral corruption. Up until then, the Romans had inclined towards the practice of virtue, so they were practically virtuous. And when they started to study virtue, they lost their virtue. So there's this idea that the Romans of the Republic were originally virtuous, and then they started to inquire about virtue by the influence of the conquest, which brought about cultural influence of the Greek. And then they started to become a people of scientists and philosophers, and they started to degenerate morally, according to Rousseau. Then there's a very famous passage, prosopopée, which means, I don't know if it's an English word, it's when it's a literary device when you imagine that a dead figure or a non-human figure speaks. And then he makes Fabricius, who was an ancient Roman virtuous republican. And what would Fabricius say about what Rome had become after the decline of the Republic and the rise of the empire? And he says, the only talent worthy of Rome is to conquer the world in order to bring virtue, to make virtue reign supreme. And what is the greatest show ever seen under the sky, under the heaven? An assembly of 200 virtuous men worthy of commanding to Rome and to govern the earth. So that's the kind of ideas. When you read this, a part of your soul is elevated, because the prose of Rousseau, my translation is terrible, but in French it's not beautiful, it's hypnotizing. The way he speaks, the way he writes, his ideas are kind of crazy, but he presents them so well that one is drawn. And Rousseau has had a tremendous political influence both on the left, the radical left, and also unconsciously on the radical right. What I've been saying could be the speech of a radical far-right leader. He says that if Socrates came back among us, 18th century France, he would not have been forced to drink poison, but he would have to suffer a fate which is even more bitter. He would have been laughed at, despised. He would have been laughed at, which is much worse than death, he says. He says that the eternal wisdom of the eternal wisdom of God, I guess, had placed us in a happy ignorance. So there's this idea that we were primordial. That's a very Calvinist, Protestant, and Christian idea, that we were originally happy, and when we started to seek knowledge, everything degenerated. That's the myth of the Garden of Eden. That we were happy when we were ignorant. That's an idea that we find in Rousseau, because he's a Christian thinker. And he says, how humiliating for mankind these ideas are. Our pride must be mortified. Probity, which is virtue, should be the daughter of ignorance. Science and virtue would be incompatible. So he is preaching a love of ignorance and primitive lack of knowledge in front of, I mean, it's not it's not an oral speech, it's a written dialogue, a written discourse, but he's praising ignorance in front of one of the most prestigious academies of France, in an age where France was one of the most dominant countries in the world in terms of culture and political power. And he won the discourse by praising ignorance in an academia. So one can see that Rousseau was deeply Christian, Calvinist. He was a radical egalitarian, but at the same time he was an ardent patriot. He was conflicted and subtle and ambiguous, and he was a very knowledgeable, very intelligent man who used his intelligence and his knowledge to condemn intelligence and knowledge. And who wrote discourses in a superb prose, a hypnotizing, a magnificent prose to denounce rhetorics. He was one of the most brilliant rhetorical writer ever, who wrote to denounce the negative consequences of rhetorics. So, yeah. I will stop there for now. That's the end of the third part. But, yeah. Rousseau is a very mysterious figure.